Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
Nearly 3 months since Israel and the United States attacked Iran's nuclear program, Washington and Tehran have both tentatively signaled that they're ready to resume talks. Separately, the E3 grouping of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom recently triggered the Snapback mechanism to reimpose UN sanctions against Iran, putting added pressure on Tehran to come to the table and address Western concerns about its nuclear intentions. What are the prospects for a renewal of negotiations at this point? How might the imposition of snapback sanctions affect calculations? And how is Iran likely to respond as the regime deals with the political reverberations of a 12-day war?
To discuss these issues and more, we're joined by Eyre, Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute. Alan is a former senior U.S. diplomat and Iran expert who served as the State Department's first Persian-language spokesperson and as a core member of the U.S. negotiating team for the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. He led key regional offices and advised on U.S. policy toward Iran for over 2 decades.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gunul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Alan, thank you so much for joining us today on Middle East Focus.
Thanks for having me. It's a real honor.
So let's begin with the prospect for restarting U.S.-Iranian talks over Iran's nuclear program, which, as our listeners are going to recall, they were halted in mid-June by the outbreak of the Israel-Iran war in which the U.S. supported Israel. So over the past 2 or 3 months, we've been hearing comments from the U.S. and the Iranian sides that they're ready to sit down and resume bilateral discussions. Top-level Trump administration officials suggested as early as June 22nd, so within hours of U.S. airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, that renewed negotiations with Iran were possible. And Iran's National Security Council secretary expressed his government's qualified openness in August. And for what it's worth, on September 8th, the Iranian media reported that Tehran officially decided over the weekend to resume talks with Washington. So, Alan, 2-part question for you to start. How likely are the U.S. and Iran to resume talks in the near future? And what would the Americans and Iranians actually be negotiating about at this point? Would it be just about the nuclear program, as had apparently been the case over the 5 first rounds earlier this year? Or could the administration be looking to widen the aperture to encompass other issues as well?
When I was Persian language spokesperson, anytime someone said they had a 2-part question, I was like, no, actually, you got 2 questions. I was like, I've got a 15-part question. No, you had 15 questions. So, but I'll answer your 2-part question. How likely is a resumption of negotiations? My sense is that Iran is keen to re-engage just because they value process so much. I don't think I think it unlikely they feel it probable that they could reach an agreement, a modus vivendi with the U.S., but for a whole bunch of reasons we can talk about, they want to be seen as willing to engage, right, with the U.S. So I think, almost immediately after the ceasefire, there was a perceived need to just re-engage, just to show that they were trying to play well with others. Conversely, I don't necessarily see a keen desire on the part of our government, the U.S. government, to engage, in the sense that, we've essentially declared mission accomplished. President Trump has said we've obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. Whatever political benefit I think we feel we've gleaned from it has been gleaned. So what is the impetus for the U.S. unless Iran is going to change its red lines, which it's given no indication of doing? The key difference being, I think the U.S. is still insisting on zero enrichment in Iran, and Iran still wants some sort of capability for indigenous enrichment. So unless Iran is willing to loosen its red lines, and I think our own red lines have become more expansive, more maximalist since the end of the war, the U.S. doesn't need to. Time is on our side.
Is the lack of trust between the two sides, is that an obstacle at all?
Not really. I mean, I forget what Israeli ex-prime minister said. You never negotiate with your friends. Negotiations is not predicated on trust. Reagan said trust but verify. I think our motto, and I think the Iranians' motto and the U.S. motto is don't trust and verify. So No, I think the lack of trust is a given. It's certainly worse now, obviously, than it was before the Israeli attack on Iran. And that's helped Iran to an extent domestically because it's validated the internal narrative they have, which is you can't trust the U.S., which is, one of the key themes of the supreme leader. And this, to them at least, has proven that. Like, a couple of days before the sixth round, the U.S. gave the green light to these attacks. This is the Iranian narrative. So the lack of trust is a given. It's worse now, but, both sides are professionals. Reaching a successful agreement is not predicated on liking the other people, you know? So that's not a deal breaker.
I wanted to ask Alan about the snapback issue and the fact that the Europeans have been increasingly concerned about Iran's moves towards nuclear breakout since the June 12-day war, such as its decision to expel inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency and to further enrich uranium stocks. On August 28th, Berlin, London, Paris, the so-called E3 announced that they would trigger the reimposition of snapback sanctions under the 2015 nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, if Tehran doesn't come back into compliance within 30 days. How does the E3's snapback decision affect the dynamics of diplomatic negotiation over Iran's nuclear program? And how much do these additional sanctions matter to the Islamic Republic, given that it's one of the most sanctioned countries in the world for decades now?
It's another turn of the screw in the sense that it's another timetable. The Europeans did this because they had to do it, because no one among the E3 wanted a situation where if you did nothing, then come October 18th, Iran is once again treated like a normal, member of the NPT. So it was either, it literally was use it or lose it. And, this is not your father's E3. Back when I was doing this, the E3 was certainly not pro-Iranian, but they weren't truculent. And they were, I think, more willing to engage with Iran and just devote themselves to the process. This E3 is far less so. The non-compliance report by the IAEA in early June. And again, just the cumulative toll of Iranian noncompliance and Iran just not really playing well with the international community on the nuclear issue. I think they got fed up. And you add to that, the European desire to be seen by the Trump administration as an ally for a whole bunch of other reasons. So, yeah, it made sense that they would do the snapback. And of course, they've said they think this is a triggering mechanism to expedite negotiations so that, they can extend it for 6 months and there'll be some progress. We all know the three conditions that the EU E3 put forward: re-engagement with the U.S., full cooperation with the IAEA, and full cooperation in terms of identifying where all the enriched uranium is. Iran's not going to do that. So the question now becomes: can Iran do enough of it, engage with the U.S., pretend to cooperate with the IAEA? They just met with Grossi on Saturday, so that they can extend the snapback by however long a time. I don't think so, but this is the wolf closest to the sled for Iran.
So play for time is your expectation of what Iran will do, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not just, but yeah. Try to get a 6-month extension. And again, the practical effect, to an extent, it's already happened. The Iranian currency's in a death spiral. China and Russia have signaled they oppose snapback, and they could well drag their feet at the UN in implementation, which could vitiate the effects and the implementation of the snapped back sanctions. So as a practical matter, they could definitely dilute the effect of it, but to a large extent, it's psychological. Certainly for the Iranian people. If once again these UN sanctions are put back in place, and once again they're facing, the opprobrium of the Western world, it's, economically, it's not a good for their already weak economy.
Yeah, and just to note for our listeners that Moscow will be taking over the presidency
Right.
of the UN Security Council in October, so that also
Yeah. Which is why the Europe did what it did.
exactly.
I wanted to do it while South Korea was still ahead.
So where does this leave Europe once the snapback sanctions are actually imposed? What other kind of leverage or cards do they have to play here as they try to influence Iran's calculus on this issue?
Zero. I mean, again, one of the differences between when we were doing this and now is that when we were doing this, this was a team effort. The U.S. did extensive coordination, with everybody, including Saudi and Israel, even though they were not, for the deal. Um, right now, it's a bilateral issue. The key players in this are President Trump, Steve Witkoff, Iran, and to a lesser extent, Israel and Saudi and the UAE. The Europeans, now that they've pulled the trigger on this, and Arakchi said this yesterday, and or 2 days ago, he had a piece in the Guardian. He says basically, if you do this, you will put yourself out of relevance, and he's right to an extent, unless they extend the snapback.
Do you think the European snapback sanctions will give American negotiators additional leverage?
Yeah, I think as a tactical matter, it will, because one of the prerequisites for the E3 to consider kicking the can down the road is a re-engagement with the U.S. So yeah, it definitely gives the U.S. more leverage, but we're not looking for leverage, I don't think, in the sense that we've got a set of proposals on the table, and we're not willing to modify those or at least make them less draconian or less severe. And so it's up to Iran to either come to the table or not come to the table. I think our administration is perfectly fine if the snapbacks come in. If the Iranians want to talk beforehand, we're willing to talk, but we're in a good place.
Looking at the other side of the equation from the Iranian perspective, if this were to harden Iran's position, what would that look like? And do you think there's a real risk that Iran could potentially leave the nuclear nonproliferation treaty?
Yeah, it's an increased risk. I mean, there's intermediate steps. That would be a maximalist reaction to developments. They could pull out of the safeguard agreement, which is an intermediate step. I would counsel that no one should really pay too much attention to whatever bill passes the Iranian Majlis. That's perhaps a necessary but not sufficient condition for Iran to do anything. You know, Iran's policy decisions will not be made by their legislative body, the Majlis, right? That's more signaling. So does it put them in a harder place? Yeah, it does. Israel bombed them. The U.S. bombed them. All three pillars of their little strategic deterrence tool have been obliterated. So they're in a bad place. They know they're in a very bad place. Everyone's saying that this is why I think to a large extent, paradoxically, it decreases their flexibility because, for Supreme Leader Khamenei, who is still, at least in theory, the supreme decision maker, and to an extent it's been embodied in the whole strategic decision-making apparatus in Iran, if you show weakness, that's chum in the water. USSR, Saddam, Gaddafi, all the colored revolutions. If you're perceived as weak, that's not the time to loosen up. That's the lesson. That's the principle Iran operates on.
Are the Iranians coming into these talks from as much of a position of weakness as we might believe? Because they were certainly trying to set the agenda and preconditions in recent weeks through many of their public statements about coming back to talks with the United States. So what explains the Iranians' confidence and defiance going into these theoretical negotiations? Is it just tactical posturing, or is this some sort of separate calculation going on inside of Iran?
The Iranians have a great saying. They say something like, "Man bidinistem ke ba chenin bad belarzam." I'm not a willow that shakes with such a breeze. They've had bad things happen to them since 1979, right? Mike Tyson says everyone's got a plan till they've been punched in the face. They've been punched in the face a lot. Okay? So they still have a plan. So for Iran, snapbacks is a bad thing, right? Israel bombing them, very bad thing. U.S. doing the same, right? But that's not necessarily going to force them to loosen up, okay? They've had lots of bad things happen. They just lost how many of their senior commanders, right? But it's actually very similar to the early days of the revolution, where the Mujahideen and the leftist groups and everyone, they were blowing up Iranian leaders all the time. Khamenei's missing, not missing, but doesn't have the use of a hand, right? Saeed Jalili, who was, one of the head negotiators when I was doing it in the beginning, his leg doesn't work. Okay, so getting beaten up isn't as bad in sort of the Iranian Weltanschauung as it is for us. So we look at Iran, all three pillars of its strategic deterrence, stool have been wiped out. Tehran bombed, many people dead. We think, wow, they're so weak now. They gotta come to the table. That's extrapolating from a set of values and priorities that they don't necessarily have. Okay, because for them it's regime survival. What will they do next that enhances regime survival? And for them, I don't think it's kissing the ring.
Where do you think their mind is on that question of strategic survival? What are they trying to achieve instead, as they're you know uh, playing for time on the negotiations front?
Again, I think they certainly are going to try to stave off snapback. I think they want to engage with the U.S., not because they think they can get a deal, but because they need to be seen as engaging with the U.S. Um, I think that, they've got to figure out, they always say, what is it? Generals always fight the last war. So the inertial response is, do you reconstitute your support for the proxies to the extent you can? Do you try to rebuild your air defense, get new missiles? Do you try to rebuild your whole nuclear infrastructure that's been blown apart? Or do you try something different? They don't need to rebuild all their civilian nuclear facilities if they want to either race toward a bomb or slow crawl toward a bomb. So I think certainly they're thinking about whether they need to, in fact, build a nuclear weapon. That's a decision that's ongoing. And even before Israel attacked, you saw people affiliated with the supreme leader saying openly, well, we might have to reconsider trying for a nuclear weapon. The former foreign minister Kharazi was one of them. In terms of whether they try and reconstitute the other parts of the deterrence triad, that's going to be hard to do. So they haven't decided yet. And the people who would have decided are dead. So, first of all, they got to figure out who's inside the circle. Who do you trust? Because don't forget, this was a massive intelligence failure on the part of Iran also. Okay. So who do you trust? Who are the key people in the room now? Because the people that Khamenei put in, who he cultivated a relationship with over decades, many of them are dead. Now, he knows the new people, he picked them too, but still, it's a whole new set of actors. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to this, but I do know it's going to take time. And more importantly, Iran doesn't make big strategic turns in the water while they're making these decisions. So, all things being equal, until Iran feels good about sort of who's where, and everyone's in line, they got their ducks in a row, I don't see them making any volte-faces, in terms of instead of A, we're going to do anti-A, or, it's going to be inertial.
So, given everything you just said, is this an optimal time to restart talks, especially from the U.S. standpoint, or should we wait?
I'm just a softie. I always think it's a good time to talk. I've always said that, while talking is always a necessary but not sufficient condition. So you're not going to solve anything. We didn't solve anything kinetically. Okay, we didn't obliterate Iran's nuclear program forever. We did some serious damage, right? And it's going to take a long time to reconstitute in some type of form or another. But it's still a problem because once Iran learned how to enrich, it becomes a question of modifying their intentions and not their capabilities. We've modified their capabilities. We've also perhaps changed their intentions. So is it a good time to talk? I don't think the current administration feels the need to discuss. As I said, we think that we've won. So you can come on the battleship Missouri and sign the surrender papers, or not, but, our position's not going to change. But yeah, I do think that any type of new regional security alignment in the Persian Gulf is going to require ongoing dialogue. Now, I think it's more important that Iran talk to Saudi and to the UAE. I'd actually be perfectly fine if the U.S. sort of just takes a knee and Iran starts talking in regional security fora with Saudi and with the UAE and other actors, because I think that's the real long-term solution.
wanted to turn next to draw a little bit on your previous experience in the last round of negotiations. And what are your takeaways so far from what we've seen with the Trump administration's approach to the first 5 rounds of talks before the 12-day war? How did that compare or contrast to your own experience under the Obama administration?
I'll divide my experience in the Obama administration into 2 parts. And the first part was very similar to what's happening now, which is we would meet infrequently with the Iranians. It was very kabuki. Everyone would gather around a plenary table. Everyone would read their set speeches. Then everyone would go off to their control rooms. And EU, first Solana and then Lady Ashton, would pass messages, like,
Mm.
hey, US, Iran says this. Oh, well, you tell Iran we say this. We spent as much time negotiating about where to meet for the next round of negotiations as about substantive issues. So it was not productive. It was only when after Rouhani got elected, Zarif came, and then we just said, look, we'll meet here or here. It doesn't matter. And people talked bilaterally. The Iranians were in the same room with the U.S. We talked for a long time, days on end. We had real experts talking to their real experts. Then you started making progress. From what I can tell, and again, I have to stress, I'm not talking to the current administration's people. They haven't reached out or asked me or anything like that. But it seems to be the case that what was happening was not negotiations. It was somewhat desultory discussions where we would fly a very small team. The Omanis would, mediate for the most part, though there was some direct discussions. Then it would stop, and a week or so later, we'd do the same thing for a couple of hours. So the pace of discussions, I think, was not, there wasn't enough catalyst in the Petri dish for anything to come out of that.
Mhm.
If I had a magic wand, I would say it was something like Esalen back in the 60s. I'd get everyone in a room and lock the door and say, no bathroom breaks until, until you show progress.
If you were talking to them, what advice would you give the Trump administration now about how to approach this?
Again, not every problem has a solution. It could well be for a variety of reasons. We cannot find a solution. So even though, diplomacy is a necessary condition for progress, it might not be sufficient this time. So I don't know if you can get from A to B, given all that's going on right now, especially given the fact that the one driving the nuclear issue is still Israel. Israel's going to decide, whether it's happy with the state of Iran's nuclear program. And if it's not, it'll go back in. But if I were, all things being equal, the more you talk to them substantively with the requisite expertise in the room, the more likely you'll get some sort of progress. And we owe it to ourselves because, it's an increasingly, Mona Yakubian said this a couple of months or so ago, it's an increasingly Hobbesian Middle East, So that's not a good thing. So to the extent that we can get in front of that and set up lines of communication between ourselves and the Iranians, between Iran and the Saudis, or Iran and the UAE, that's a good thing.
The Iranians are notorious for dragging out negotiations. Something
You're telling me this.
Yes, something you yourself know very well.
Yeah, thanks.
But the time frame here before snapback sanctions kick in is quite short. We're T-minus a couple of weeks at this point. How do you think the Iranians will respond to that kind of time pressure? Do you think if they really wanted to, they could negotiate a deal much more rapidly than they have in the past?
No, I think like I said, I think they're on tilt now.
Yeah.
I think at best, there's this thing in fiqh, in Islamic jurisprudence, called ijma, which is where you all decide together about something. It's a consultative process. Iran foreign policy, less so now, more so in the past, always was that. You got a whole bunch of people in a room and you came to decision. Now it's a lot more unilateral with, the supreme leader and his people, I think. I think they're slower now. They don't, again, they've got to figure out who to trust, who not to trust. They, don't have the same confidence in their ability to deter future aggression. They're still reeling. They're still shaking it off. So I think they're going to move slower. And again, the E3 has started a clock, and they're aware of that. And they're trying to, they've done certain things to streamline decision-making processes. They've reinstituted at the National Security Council, a Supreme Defense Council, which they had during the days of the war. They've moved the portfolio from Shamkhani to Larijani. But yeah, no, they're going to move slower, and they're less likely to take bold steps.
In an article that you wrote about a year ago for MEI, you said one of the reasons the P5+1 were able to successfully reach an agreement with Iran on the 2015 JCPOA was because there was only one issue under negotiation. That it was unlikely that an agreement could have been reached if all the parties were also talking about support for the proxies, missiles, horrible human rights record, all that other stuff. Basically, that Iran had kind of limited carrying capacity. Assuming all this is still true, is the Iranian nuclear program in fact the most important issue of all that to prioritize, or is it even the likeliest to be able to achieve a deal at this point?
I'll answer your second question first. It's certainly not the likeliest. I mean, you could pick some incredibly secondary, unimportant issue and, come to a deal tomorrow. And that might be something you want to do as a confidence building measure. Just go through the physical motion of agreeing. Like a salesman wants you to say yes a couple times, so you get used to saying yes. So, we got to get the side used to saying yes. But to my mind, the most important issue, or at least time sensitive, especially if Iran decides to move toward a nuclear weapon, is the nuclear issue. Now I think the U.S. has, again, because we're feeling pretty good about where things are, might have expanded its asks. Recently, Ali Larijani said that the U.S. was being, I forget the adjective he used, but being intemperate or being excessive by seeking restrictions on Iran's missiles, which previously we haven't done. So, if we're asking for zero enrichment, limitations on their missiles, limitations on their support to proxies, these are all good goals, don't get me wrong. But, all things being equal, solving two contentious issues is harder than solving one contentious issue. So, yeah, nuclear proliferation is not a good thing. So to my mind, at least, that's more time sensitive than, talking to Iran about fulfilling its human rights obligations, or talk to them about, their missiles. Iran's military is very weak, okay? And ours is really strong. And we all know Iran, of necessity, has pursued a strategy of asymmetrical response. Okay. So one has to be cognizant of that when sort of seeking what to limit. And Iran has already said, we are willing to limit our nuclear program. We are willing to drastically reduce the levels of enrichment, the amount of enriched material, drastically increase IAEA verification in exchange for lifting of sanctions. So they've got the muscle memory, right? They've done it before. So that's why some of the reasons why I think the nuclear issue is the least bad option.
Well, as we're fast running down our own discussion clock here, how optimistic do you feel about the potential for further U.S.-Iran talks?
I am cautiously pessimistic.
And why is that?
Again, I just don't think that. I mean, the talks could happen. Whether something comes out of them, that's where my pessimism kicks in. I don't think we need a solution at this point. I think the U.S. government has decided we're already there. We've done sufficient damage to the nuclear program to move it aside and focus on other issues. It's funny. You always would hear this thing, and when you'd ask about what the U.S. is doing, people say, "Oh, we can walk and chew gum at the same time." And yeah, the U.S. government can walk and chew gum at the same time, but it can't do thoracic surgery and a Rubik's cube at the same time, right? Governments, when it comes to important, complicated issues, have a carrying capacity. And right now, this is one of the reasons why the Obama administration succeeded with Iran, because it said, I'm going to focus on Iran. I'm going to make this a priority, not one of 15 priorities, but one of an incredibly, 2 or 3 priorities. And they had to break a lot of glass with the Israelis, with the Saudis, with the Hill to get it done. But it happened. And you can argue about whether it was worth it or not, but they did it. That's not happening now. Okay. This administration has devoted the calories it wants to devote to this. It's got the benefit it wants to get out of this. So I think that we're just not that into it anymore. So
Is there anything you would like to plug to our listeners? Anything you're working on or would like them to be on the lookout for?
The thing that interests me most these days is what no one in the region talks about. I just finished 4 years as the political counselor in Amman, Jordan, which is one of the most water-stressed countries in the Middle East. I think like 18 of the 21 MENA countries, or at least the vast majority of MENA countries, are water-stressed. Who was it? William Gibson said the future arrives unevenly. It's arrived in the Middle East, okay, in terms of drought, water shortages, heat. I mean, the hottest temperatures in the world are there in southern Iran. So there's a whole panoply of issues related to climate change that they're going to hit all of us. They are hitting all of us. They're hitting the Middle East first and worst. And to an extent, no one's talking about it. Iran is facing a classic not guns versus butter, guns versus water moment. And they're picking guns. The Majlis just passed a bill upping their military budget. Meanwhile, they're running out of water, okay? They got other issues they got to deal with. So, there's a certain discontinuity between what's coming next and what's come before that not just Iran, but few Middle Eastern governments are focusing on. And that's unfortunate.
Alan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you both for having me. I hope I made sense, or at least was internally consistent.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in this week. Finally, a big thanks to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Iran and U.S. policy on the Middle East, please visit our website at www.mei.edu. You can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.